Hey, this is Matthew Ellison, president at 1615. We are passionate about equipping the people of God for the mission of God. And one of the ways we do that is by providing Great Commission resources, just like the webinar you're about to watch today. We hope you are blessed by what you hear. If you have comments or questions, leave them right here. Well, greetings and welcome to another 1615 webinar. I am Matthew Ellison, president at 1615. And we are so glad you are with us today. I am particularly looking forward to today's topic as someone who has spent a lot of time in youth ministry over my years in ministry, so thankful for this opportunity. Today's webinar is entitled Mobilizing Gen Z. We're excited to be joined by Jolene Erlacher from Leading Tomorrow. She is the founder, as well as Katy White from GoCorps. They are authors of Mobilizing Gen Z, Challenges and Opportunities for the Global Age of Missions. As I mentioned, I'm looking forward to today's webinar, also learning from these two as they talk about how to mobilize a new generation of missions leaders and missionaries. So in just a moment, we're going to start the webinar, and I'm going to hand the controls over to Jolene first. But first, just a few things. Your phones are muted to preserve sound quality, so you can listen through your computer speakers or you can call in on the telephone. As questions come to mind today, please type them in the question and answer panel located in the GoToWebinar task panel, which is on the upper right-hand side of your screen. We'll be addressing those questions the last 15 or 20 minutes of our time together, and I encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity to enter into the dialogue with Katy and Jolene. Over 200 people are registered for today's webinar. You'll be able to view this webinar in the next couple of weeks at 1615.org and pass it on to others as well. Well, I'm going to hand the controls over to Jolene, which will take me just a second here. And Jolene, if you could turn on your webcam so people can see you, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, my name's Jolene, and I have been doing generational research for over a decade now, just looking at how do we engage the next generation in what God is doing. My most recent book was written with Katy White. I also have my own business, Leading Tomorrow, where I do training and consulting on engaging the next generation with churches, missions agencies, nonprofits, all types of businesses, just looking at how do we equip and really empower this next generation to do what God's calling them to do.
My name is Katy, and I currently work with GoCorps, where I help mobilize young adults into missional placements all around the world. I'm really passionate about this generation. Have absolutely loved working with Jolene and thinking through what can we do to help send more of this generation overseas. And we're excited to get to chat with you guys today about how to mobilize Gen Z.
Hello, everyone. It's so great to be with you today, just talking about a topic that's near and dear to Katy and I's heart and to your heart. Thank you for tuning in today. So, Mobilizing Gen Z. I'm going to start out our webinar today giving us a little bit of the context and the high-level overview of what's going on with this next generation. And then Katy is going to jump in and really talk through some of the specifics that we're seeing with this generation. So, in case you're just wondering, who is Gen Z? Who are we talking about as we're discussing this generation? Gen Z are really those born roughly between 1995 and 2010, give or take a few years. So those roughly in their mid-20s down into the early teens. And this generation, along with young millennials and Gen Alpha, who's coming behind them, really represent a new era in many ways. So that's what I want to kind of paint the picture of as we get started. I like to call it a hinge moment. When a hinge moves, everything kind of changes. Doors open, doors close. It can indicate something, we're moving forward in a new direction. And as we look at these younger generations, they really are kind of walking through an unprecedented door in many ways. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the context of what is happening as we're mobilizing this next generation. So really quickly, I just am going to read this one quote. Every few hundred years throughout Western history, a sharp transformation occurs. During this time, in a matter of decades, everything changes. Society altogether rearranges itself. Its values, its worldview, its basic values, its social and political structures, its arts, its key institutions, and 50 years later, a new world exists, and the people born into that world cannot even imagine the world in which their grandparents lived and into which their own parents were born. Our age is such a period of transformation. So as we think about these younger generations, really they're being born into this context where everything is changing. For older generations, it can sometimes feel like the bottom is falling out of things as everything is different. And the younger generations are being raised in a world that feels like it's constantly chaotic, constantly changing, and that there's very little that's predictable or known. And so this is the whole world that Gen Z has known, something that is they cannot necessarily count on. It is not necessarily predictable. So as we're looking at this generation, growing up as a missionary kid, I tend to look at things through the lens of culture. We're seeing that this generation really is not just facing generational gaps, but they're facing cultural gaps with the generations that have preceded them. And most of our agencies, our churches, our programs for mobilizing were built on a previous era, on the modern era. So as Gen Z is kind of engaging in our churches and missions, in our families, our schools, all these things, they are encountering not just a generational gap, but this cultural gap. They are a generation that's been forged in a world of what I like to say is postmodern, post-colonial, post-truth, post-Christian, post-missions. So I'm just going to unpack these briefly before Katy jumps into some of the specific characteristics that we are seeing with this next generation. So really quickly, postmodernism, we've heard this term for a long time. So I just want to highlight a couple of the key things that are kind of impacting this next generation at a very foundational level. So when we look at the broad scope of history, we see multiple eras: the pre-modern era, where every society believed in some supernatural power; the modern era, where we really put a lot of faith and reason in humanity to solve things, science. And now we've entered the postmodern era, where really we're questioning everything, we're deconstructing everything. There's no universal foundation for morality or human dignity in culture today. And it really is captured well, this idea in Friedrich Nietzsche's quote, "You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, the correct way, the only way, it does not exist." And so when Gen Z is being called to, serve God, to step up and do something bold and brave, it can be very disorienting because of this post-truth context that they're in. And post-truth indicates that its circumstances no longer are based on objective facts, that facts are less influential than emotions and personal beliefs. So we're going to step into this piece because it's really, really critical. This next generation has really been taught to value emotions, stories, experiences over objective reality. And so as we're talking to them about the global needs in the world and what God has for their lives, we have to put on this missionary cross-cultural mindset and make sure we're speaking this language that resonates with them, which is much more this postmodern, subjective reality approach. Now, it does not mean that we're saying there's no truth. Clearly, there's absolute truth. But the language that they resonate is this language of emotion. What is your experience? How are you interacting and participating in things? Because they've been taught that subjective reality, perception, determines what is true. Even strong, godly young people resonate with this language of your experience, your story, your emotions. So we're just seeing the shift even in how we communicate, the language we use as we're engaging them in eternal truths, to make sure that we're really focusing on just their experience of it. This is also tying into how they engage with authority and respect. We've shifted from traditional models of authority and respect, where people had credibility based on experience, education, title, and position, to an emerging kind of context where young people have a voice, they have information and influence from a very young age. They don't have to go to school for a decade. They don't have to have a title or position to influence other people and have a voice. And as a result today, they really respect and connect with people who come across as trustworthy and authentic, where there's a relational connection, and where they feel like there's competence, because competence is no longer connected solely to experience and education, but really to our knowledge of whatever we're interacting with. So not only is it engaging this next generation in this new context where we view truth as connected to our experiences, but also really connecting as a credible voice through trustworthy, authentic relational connection. This is a generation that's also grown up in a post-Christian America. It's a very different context. Many people say Gen Z is the first post-Christian generation that we are seeing. And so they have had a very different experience just being prepared for what God has for them. Many of them are going to church, if they're regular church attenders, 1 to 2 times a week, as opposed to older generations that often went 1 to 2 times a month, as opposed to older generations who would go 1 to 2 times a week. So their exposure to scripture, their exposure to missions has been greatly reduced, even if they are a regular church attendant. In addition, most Americans are reading the Bible less, including parents and others who are engaging with the next generation. And so overall, this is a generation that has very low biblical literacy, which is resulting in some challenges as we're looking to mobilize them, as well as opportunities. The other thing that we're seeing with this generation is that they are just being discipled in a context where the worldview around them does not necessarily match the worldview that we are encouraging them to embrace in the church and in missions. Only 4% of Gen Z has a biblical worldview, as opposed to 10% of boomers, 9% of Gen X, 7% of millennials. So we're just seeing this kind of shift in the percentage of each generation that has a biblical worldview. That can be disconcerting, but there's also great hope. God is raising up a generation, a young generation, a remnant that is faithful and committed to God, even as maybe their peer group is not as supportive of what they feel called to or what they believe. David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock in their book Faith for Exiles just really talk about how today the culture is insidiously faith repellent. I like this quote because it captures just how difficult it can be for a Gen Zer to develop a resilient faith. The culture around them literally repels a resilient faith. And we know that it's harder to grow if we use the methods of the 20th century. So we have to think about this again in a cross-cultural manner. How do we disciple the next generation with new methods, new approaches that are going to be effective today? There is a countercultural 10% of young Christians whose faith is vibrant and robust. Now, what can be discouraging is that really represents only about 4 million young people in the US today who are willing to say, hey, I'm going to go, I'm going to live out my faith, act out my faith, but they are there. And God has always used a remnant. He's always used maybe what seems unlikely, and we are seeing that be the case with Gen Z as well. So there is great hope, and we want to find ways to really encourage them to remain faithful. The last thing I want to touch on before I turn over to Katy is just the post-missions church. So much has changed even in the church as we are mobilizing the next generation, making their experience very different than previous generations. So for the silent generation, for the boomers and Gen X, most of us who are older, I'm a Gen Xer, we grew up in a context where the church reflected many of the cultural values. So cultural values did not always conflict. They did to an extent, but there was still some agreement between church and modern values or norms. Cultural morality still had biblical influence in it. Church attendance was more the norm, and just in general, there was an understanding of missions. Whereas for millennials and Gen Z, with postmodern values informing everything around them, living in a post-truth world that's often anti-biblical in a post-Christian context, with a lack of, therefore, education regarding missions, often they're coming into the conversation about missions in a very different place than the older generations. So what we're seeing today with this next generation is really an opportunity to inspire, equip a remnant of young people, and they are a precious resource. I call them a seed generation because whenever you go through a winter, you have to reserve the seed to plant in the spring. And at times when we look at the statistics, it seems like there's a lot of winter in our culture, but God has a seed that he is going to use for the next generation. Savannah Kimberlin, who did a lot of the research on Gen Z for Barna, she says an implication of the current trends in church attendance is that young people who are going to step up in this context and say they want to participate in missions are going to mean it, because it's not normal, it's countercultural. With an overall decline in church attendance, the number of potential missionaries is also declining. So we just have to recognize that this is a unique season where we need to just come alongside this remnant and really equip them for what is coming. Ed Stetzer has a great quote where he says, "The Great Commission is still for everyone, but now the mission is from everywhere to everywhere. The future we know is going to be different than the past." And as we mobilize this next generation, we really see that as the case. We're going to need to be willing to engage new strategies and new approaches as we equip them for missions. So let's take a little deeper dive into Gen Z and some of their specific characteristics. I'm going to turn it over to Katy to just step in here and talk some specifics about Gen Z.
Awesome. Thanks, Jolene. Yeah, good to be with you all today. So you can see on this slide here, this is a snapshot of Gen Z. So keeping in mind all of this just convergence of all these posts and all of these things that Gen Z is experiencing, what are some of the distinct characteristics of this cohort? You'll find this as an appendix in the book we wrote. If you want to do a deeper dive into all of the book, we'll give you a lot more research and context for why we're seeing these trends in young adults. Knowing some of the hows can give you a lot of empathy as well as some understanding for how we go about coming alongside and mentoring and discipling this generation. But today I'm just going to give you a really quick overview and then dive into a few specific ones for what are those implications then that then present for mobilizing them in mission involvement, as well as a few practical strategies and suggestions to really help redeem the challenges that they face as well as grow and hone their strengths. So you can see here Gen Z, they are strikingly individualistic as well as being both curious and well-informed with unprecedented access to information. They are native to the digital world. The youngest of them didn't even know a world when there wasn't a smartphone. They're also very adept at creating virtual relationships all over the world and creating meaning and belonging through not just face-to-face interactions. This generation is searching for happiness as a main goal in life. Although without a grounding definition of happiness, and happiness is whatever you want it to be, this can cause a lot of anxiety and make the world feel like a very shifting place for them. This generation are risk averse and can be uncomfortable with ambiguity. They're also focused on financial and emotional security is a major influence and goal of what they're seeking in life. And they're very pragmatic about their education and their career choices. The next slide continues. They are also cautious and realistic in decision making, as well as being diverse and tolerant of ideas and identities. They are questioning and skeptical of traditions and institutions. We're also seeing this generation facing great relational pressures due to social media and experiencing greater levels of anxiety and depression. They are innovative, very entrepreneurial and creative, as well as they're really interested in making a unique contribution to the world around them. But above all, what we hope you realize and understand coming away from this webinar is that they are a God-designed generation for a God-given task. I really believe that some of the challenges as well as the strengths that they have are meant for the world that they're in. And it's our job as their leaders and mentors and figuring out how do we release them into the world that God has created them to be a witness in. So what are some implications for mobilization? How do these things affect the way that they see and respond to missions? One of the first ones is that they are looking for more practical careers. So this is pretty different than millennials, who we were mostly mobilizing before. That was the generation right before Gen Z. Millennials were characterized by this chase your dreams mentality, but Gen Z has watched a lot of these post-recession realities in our culture saddle this generation of idealistic dreamers with underemployment. I was speaking to a young adult who was applying to serve in missions, and she said, I can remember thinking I wanted to be a missionary when I was in 6th grade, but I never thought it was a reasonable job. And even that wording right there, a reasonable job, not that it was a real job or that it was attainable to her, but that it was a reasonable job. That's something that was keeping her from really deciding if she could step forward into missions. They're not necessarily motivated by what I would say like impressive or high class careers, but they're more so motivated by financial stability, for security, and for independence. A few things this is affecting their college choice or experience for many of them. They may be choosing community colleges first or state schools and not Christian universities because of differences in cost, which again is going to help them have this more practical financial security and stability. One thing we need to keep in mind is there may be a less of a recruiting pool at some of the places where we're used to finding a lot of students who are really passionate about missions. Also, with fewer and fewer of them going to Christian universities or going only for 2 years after doing some of their other classes online or at community colleges first, many aren't reaching the steps to missions with as much biblical literacy or training. They aren't taking required New Testament classes if they're at secular campuses or community colleges. So we need to think about how are we creating opportunities for this within the context of the local church if they're not getting it as much through some of their college and career choices related to that wanting that financial stability and practical choices. Many may be choosing to live at home with families to cut costs, which means they're likely having less life experiences and growing in their own convictions and confidence at this stage, which means they need help from their leaders and mentors to draw them out and help them take some of those steps. As you are talking about missions with this generation, have very practical conversations and not just cast big vision. Again, very different than millennials. Millennials, if they bought into a vision, they dove headfirst and would figure out everything else later. But with Gen Z, they're very pragmatic. And so preparing for their future is really important. If you're trying to mobilize them to like a short-term trip or summer internships, they have a lot of other things to choose from, many which make more quote unquote sense for a stable and secure career. You have to help them see why this is a good internal investment to make and really have conversations about, what are some of their fears about future career opportunities, about finances, about what does it look like to find a spouse and raise a family if they say yes to a life of missions. This isn't to say all of these things have to make sense in the world's eyes, but it's really helpful if you can hear those concerns, validate those concerns, and then call them to something bigger, because these practical questions are a huge, huge driving factor. Fundraising can be a big barrier to this generation. Keep in mind they need biblical wisdom as well as practical help. It can help to put it in terms that they understand and that's culturally normal, like the idea of a pastor who in many churches, the church gives to the church so that the pastor can do the full-time work of the ministry, and that salary covers all their living and ministry expenses. Help them understand how other parts of our culture, they see that as normal, and use their ideas. They're very entrepreneurial. So use their ideas as they're thinking about what does it look like to fundraise and say yes to opportunities that require that step that can be really scary for them. It's also really helpful to be really honest about your own doubts and fears when you first stepped into ministry and now. They see on social media, it seems like everyone has everything together except for themselves. So help them see that it's normal to feel nervous about saying yes to a career that might feel less stable or things like that. Your story is really powerful. Share with them what it's like to place your trust in God for provision versus what the world would call a comfortable paycheck. You know, and especially with Gen Z, sharing truths biographically is more powerful than just preaching. You know, not you should feel this way because of this, but inviting them into your own thought processes. I felt this way because of this. Here's how the Lord spoke to me. Here's the doubts and fears I had. Here's the scriptures I saw that reinforce my ability to move forward in the midst of these. How does that make you feel? Another implication for mobilizing Gen Z is they are more fearful and cautious of risk. As a cohort as a whole, you're going to see outliers in this, but they've grown up in a culture of fear. The oldest of this cohort were just 4 years old when 9/11 happened, and many weren't even born, which the national conversations, media strategies, political messaging, parenting styles have all been influenced since then. So safety is a huge priority to their parents, which has made it be a huge priority to Gen Z as well. So fear can be a big barrier, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of man. I think the classic advice would be to help them reorder their priorities, but I think that's selling them short. I think we're going to find more success mobilizing this generation when we help them redefine these ideals in a biblical way. So instead of helping them, you know, communicating that they need to get rid of this fear and this need for safety and security. What does it look like to redefine the ideas of safety and security in a biblical light? You know, what they might perceive about missions is there's not safety or security in that, but how can we walk them towards a kingdom understanding of safety and security? For example, Psalm 46, you know, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of need. We won't fear though the earth gives way and the mountains move, the nations may rage, but our Lord utters his voice and the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Or helping them see, like, what does it look like for us to live as exiles in this world? Your citizenship in heaven is secure. So what does it look like to live out of that security? That's the security that we're living towards. How do you help them understand the idea of wealth biblically? You know, what does it look like to redefine these ideas? Because I think skillful leaders will need to help the young adults in their lives see they don't need to abandon these longings for safety, stability, belonging, wealth, etc. But they could see them fulfilled in their true form in a life surrendered in Jesus. You know, walk them to biblical principles where true status is found in laying down one life for another, for the humble will be exalted. Or true wealth is gained by forsaking the perishing treasures of this world for the treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy. True happiness, it's experienced in Jesus because he is the author and the source of abundant life. So make sure you're helping young people really learn some of these truths, these rich truths in the Bible. And I'm not just talking about mission scriptures, that's needed as well. Their idea of missions needs to be saturated with scripture, but also I think we'll see more of them be able to say yes to living a life surrendered to mission when we're also helping them learn core biblical concepts that they might be missing out on if they're not being discipled in the word, like the power of the resurrected Jesus, the reality that we will be hated by this world, the fact that we have a steadfast identity in Christ, the blessings that are found in trials so they don't abandon their faith when life gets hard. Also think about your messaging, you know, safety versus risk. This is very different than millennials. Risk really energized them. You know, it's like, bring on the hard because God must be in the hard. This is not as much of a motivator for Gen Zers. Not to say that they're not going to go out of their comfort zones. It's just not as much of a motivator. So does your first message or entry point as you're calling them to a life surrendered to missions need to change? You know, one example I remember, like, live life on the edge, be a missionary. That's not a motivator for why they're looking to get involved. So think about that. You really want to help Gen Z see why the risk is worth it. As you show them Jesus, they will be able to leave behind and lay down and abandon everything. You can also invite them to take smaller steps that are going to be building their confidence for bigger ones. First, starting out serving in their church, and then serving in their community locally, and then serving globally. If you have short-term missions opportunities in your pipeline, consider ones that allow for the same team with greater involvement. They could go from a short-term to a semester or internship, to a summer program, to a 1 or 2 year stint to long-term. Those incremental steps will likely be helpful for them as we help them break past this just culture of fear that they've grown up in. Another big implication for missions is they want to engage with missions in a way that combines their passions and their interests. So Gen Zers really want to make a difference. They are looking for purpose and for making their life count. They're passionate about justice and inclusivity and peace, and they really strongly desire to serve with opportunities that use their unique skills and vocations. They bring a lot to the table. They're entrepreneurial, they're creative, and they're really visionary. But one thing that's so core to Gen Z, like I mentioned earlier, they're strikingly individualistic. You know, from personalized playlists to personalized pizzas. They've grown up with products and services geared towards their individual interests and expressions. So this is another big implication for their motivations for missions. You know, what we saw in millennials was the hero generation. You know, they were motivated by making a difference in the world and making the world a better place. And they wanted to be part of this bigger movement towards good, this more collective identity or a bandwagon, jumping on this movement towards good. So if you could paint a picture of a problem they could alleviate, they got really excited and motivated. But what motivates Gen Z is personalization. So they really like feeling understood and seen and heard and celebrated. They want to leverage their skills and lean into who they are uniquely to invest themselves into something that matters. And it's more of this individual motivator, not this like collective bandwagon. So if you could paint a picture of how they specifically have things about them that can be used to help alleviate a problem, this is going to motivate them. It's a very subtle shift, but can be really profound. So with millennials, it might be, you know, how can I fight the refugee crisis? Emphasis on the refugee crisis. But with Gen Zers, it's how can I fight the refugee crisis? They're passionate about some of the similar topics, and they also want to make a difference in the world, but they're really motivated by that personalization and how they uniquely have things about them they can invest into seeing change. So think about your calls to action. You know, how can it meet that why? For an example, you know, maybe an old messaging that might have been motivating to a millennial is there are 1,000 people on this campus who don't know Christ. Let's change that. Versus as you think about that subtle shift, for Gen Zers, it might be something like 90% of the people that you sit on a daily basis with in your classroom don't know Christ. And you've been placed there for a reason. How can you make a difference so your campus knows Christ? So yes, ask lots of questions and use active listening to be able to reflect back that language that they're sharing with you as they find themselves in missions. You know, you say you love teaching, you're really passionate about education, but the American education system is just really confusing and scary for you right now. Did you know there was a way that you can use education and you can use it in mission? Or you really desire to help heal people physically, but you don't see yourself fitting into the hospital setting. God gave you that passion to help heal for a reason. Maybe what he's created you for is to place that in the hands of a missional context. Help them see how there's a path designed for them. You know, I see this in you. So I think a good next step for you is this. As you map it out, show them the resources, the people, and the plans you have in place to support them. This is going to be really help motivate them into missions. Some exciting passions and skill sets we see in many Gen Zers as you think about how can we help them use their passions and interests. They're really good at thinking outside the box and coming up with new ideas. They're native to technologies and platforms. It's intuitive, wired into the way that they think. They're not afraid to initiate change, and they desire to shape societal opinions and behaviors, and they want to leverage media. They're good at leveraging media to communicate their passions and ideas. So encourage them to dream up ways to reimagine ministry and include their voices. This last implication I'll share before I turn it back to Jolene is they really value authenticity and they seek personal connection. So being authentic is paramount to Gen Z. This is an enormous opportunity for the church. I believe they're really leading the way in creating a church culture where people can be open about their weaknesses and failures. They desire to see how God speaks into every area of their lives, even the ugly ones. And we have a God who does speak into those areas, and we have a world that needs to see it. When the world sees a perfect life, they want your life. But when the world sees your joy, your peace, and your confidence in the midst of a broken life, then they want your source of joy, peace, and confidence, and they want your God. And I really believe that the world is going to see a truer picture of Jesus through Gen Z versus the hypocrisy that is defined the way many unbelievers have seen and experienced the church. Gen Z, this is important for their leaders and mentors to know because they want leaders and mentors and organizations who are authentic and transparent. You don't be afraid to engage their questions and concerns. You may not have all the answers, but they're not looking to us to have the answers. Encourage them to go to God with their questions. I think that many young people are walking away from the faith because they believe the presence of questions equals the invalidity of their faith. But that is not true. In reality, the presence of questions reveals the effectiveness of their faith. How can you help them walk into their questions with open hands? They desire intentional mentorship. They're looking for help to grow in spiritual formation. They're open and just will soak up all of your advice and programs and resources that you can connect them to. So think about how can we disciple and mentor them into a lifestyle of missions. Also, the last thing I'll share that as it relates to this authenticity that's really important is they place value in and strongly emphasize the beauty of diversity and the honor of other cultures. So be cautious that you're not representing a savior mentality or this false dichotomy as you're communicating what you do as an organization about missions of this good versus bad or us versus them. How do you talk about other cultures? Do you celebrate the good and the beautiful of other cultures, or do you only talk about them in terms of their lack or their great need? Are you championing the successes of the global church and of local believers in the areas that you work? Are you only elevating your work or kind of crediting that change to your own mission? And are you telling stories of transformation through the lens of God redeeming what he's already created in his image? Or are you telling stories of transformation through this lens of from wrong or bad or evil to good? As you call them into mission, you can also call them to learn. Some other language to help them see is come and see how God is breaking through around the world. Go and join the local church and believers that are seeing places of some of the greatest need, seeing interest and a passion for Jesus. Call them to learn from the global church, and that's something that will also motivate in them into missions. So I'll turn it back to Jolene here to kind of wrap up our presentation section of this webinar.
So when we think about just implications for mobilization, there's a lot of implications for churches here, and I just want to capture a couple of things that Katy talked about. Gen Z is so individualistic. So as we think about the things that need to be developed in them, that need to be encouraged in them, this individualism is really, really important, because as they've grown up in a world that says your experience, your stories, your questions can kind of determine the reality that you're living, they need to be able to individualistically ask those questions, engage those questions, to be heard, to be valued, to be able to even articulate the answers to the questions that they're asking. So what Katy said about asking open-ended questions, actively listening in an authentic relationship with them is one of our most powerful tools. And the reality is, in the past, when we thought about youth ministry or young adult ministry, we often thought about how many young people can we reach? How many can we get to show up to youth group or a youth retreat or a missions conference? And the reality today is, in this season of a remnant, there's so much power, so much value in these individual relationships with key individuals around us, these young people that we see God's hand on their life. And to be able to engage them in countercultural discipleship at a relational level is one of the most transformational tools we have. Not that we stop having programs for large numbers of young people, but it's really these mentoring, coaching relationships that are having some of the greatest fruit. So they need this discipleship in biblical literacy, in identity and sexuality, technology use, theology of suffering, engaging the questions that they're asking, just some of these things we've touched on. They need these in authentic, countercultural, relational discipleship to be able to really thrive going forward. The other thing that they really need is to understand missions. So many of them don't understand missions. They're not coming into the church or into even, a context where we're talking about missions with a firm understanding. So really helping them understand the why and how. Sometimes we just assume young people understand, but today they really don't. They need those experiences and participation that Katy was talking about. They need those authentic relationships that are going to affirm their individual gifts. God has called you, and I see this calling in you. They need relationships with missionaries or with people who are passionate about connecting with the world. And they need, like Katy said, someone challenging them to something greater than themselves. So as we look at Gen Z, sometimes it can feel like it's a little overwhelming. There's so many changes, so many differences. But I just want to encourage us with this verse from Hebrews. It has become one of my life verses as I've spent the last 10 years researching generational trends. But in Hebrews 12:26, it says, "At that time his voice shook the earth. But now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens." This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken. That is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. This generation has grown up with chaos, uncertainty, fear, seeing 24/7 everything going on around them. And there's a lot of uncertainty, but God is wanting to put in them the unshakable truths. And the reality of living through a time where everything is being shaken is that we have this opportunity to really help them cement the unshakable kingdom of God in their lives and to live it out and to model it with them. And God is going to use this unlikely remnant to do amazing things in his kingdom. They are being born for such a time as this. My friend Ruben Kachala, he is a mobilizer in Malawi, has this great quote. He says, "I believe that every person has been called to go." And I share this quote because I often get the comment, well, can Gen Z even participate? Are they even prepared to go? Should we even be mobilizing out of a post-Christian culture? But Ruben shares the call to go is from everywhere to everywhere, and God has not announced that he stopped sending Americans. God has not announced that he stopped sending Europeans. Thank God that it's a day for Africa to rise up. As Africa, Asia, and Latin America are now rising to do missions, God did not say America stop. Now, Gen Z, you can just sit on the sidelines and let the global youth go and achieve this. No, we have to work together. This is kingdom work, and God has called all of us to this work. And Gen Z is entering missions in such a powerful moment that they're going to engage. We're seeing the emergence of a global youth culture right now, and they are going to join with Gen Zers globally to accomplish God's great mission, and we get to be a part of equipping them and mobilizing them in ways that may cost us some additional effort, may require some changes. So it is a little daunting at times, but it's also very, very exciting. So I'm going to turn it back over to
different, but do you know of any CRMs that are particularly Gen Z friendly? I'm wondering if that's just on a tech, like they like the interface, it's pleasant to their eyes. I'm not sure what the specifics of that are. Katy, you're muted.
Sorry, I see that now. Can we hear? Great. That's a great question. I don't know if I would have an answer particularly from a Gen Zer as they're engaging with it. I do highly encourage organizations to have some kind of management software that they can manage their relationships, where they can keep track of the young adults in their lives. They can keep track of the frequency of their communication with them. They can keep track of what they talked about the last time that they've met. So myself, as my organization, we use Salesforce on our end because there's some really helpful ways where I can have activity that lets me know how often have I connected with this person and they're due to be connected with again. So you have that consistency, and then I can also track notes for what we talked about, what prayer requests they asked for, what questions they had, so that I can follow up about that and they feel seen and heard and understood and remembered. So that has been one that has been helpful for us on our end. You want one that shows you, that reminds you to check in so that you're consistent in their life, and that also will allow you to have an opportunity to track all of your communications and conversations that you can continue to personalize and help them feel seen and known. But that's more on like my end. I'm not sure I would say it's a helpful one for them.
I think it's just that constant connection is going to be really important. So whatever tool you use is maybe more important than the interface. So finding what is helping you maintain, like Katy's saying, that ongoing relationship.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you so much. Yeah, there are a lot of CRMs out there. We just went through that process with our organization, and yes. Let's see. This person says, grateful for your presentation. Just wondering how Gen Z connects with the term remnant. I'm assuming you use that kind of towards the end. So.
I haven't gotten a lot of specific feedback on that particular term, but when I present on this topic to Gen Z, it's very validating to them. The ones that are trying to live faithfully often feel very alone, like there's not a lot of people that they can connect with. And so to feel like that is a role, like God has used unlikely individuals in the past, that are maybe not just one or two or a few faithful. I've written a book, Daniel Generation, just how God used, a faithful few through the exile to really help his people. And so just they resonate with that idea because of that individualism. They want to be unique. They want to be valued, and to know God values them as he's uniquely created them for such a time as this. That message really resonates with young people today.
Let's see. Sorry, now my go-to is it has been really glitchy today. I'm sorry. Let's see. There we go. Besides in person and at church, what modes or methods can we look at for engaging and mobilizing Gen Z?
I will let Katy jump in on this too, but one of the things we're just finding is experiences are so important. Engaging them actively in experiences that use their skills, whatever that might look like. Katy, talked about, short-term missions, but it can be very simple. Just any type of outreach, any type of, project where they're working together, where they're experiencing something, they're participating, and they're receiving that affirmation of their unique skills is so critical. So even if you're volunteering, like I was just volunteering at my VBS with some Gen Zers, and I was just, as we're volunteering, just calling out in them what I see God putting in them is really, really powerful. So I would just say, in whatever context, just doing life with them, getting around them so that you can really speak those things into their lives is important.
Yeah. I would say, obviously they're present and interacting on social media. So how can you be present and interacting on social media as well? But what we have seen a lot of success with Gen Z is how do you leverage social media to invite them into personal connections? And they're very open to personal connections. As you're answering questions and your direct messages and inviting them to have a Zoom call with someone on your staff that's just really passionate about young adults and wants to hear about their heart. So we really try and take our social media and create opportunities for them to recognize, oh, these are people that I like what they're saying. I'm interested in what they're saying. I want to learn more about their saying, and then invite them to engage with you, Zoom, or even personally, like messaging back and forth on DMs, giving that personal connection. They're really open to that. They really desire to learn, and they really desire mentorship. They're usually blown away that someone would give them the time to say, I would love to meet with you one-on-one. If you can get together in person, that's amazing. If you can't, then doing it on like a video chat platform is still pretty natural for them.
Yeah, I was listening to this webinar, and your book has led me down a rabbit hole of just really learning, and it's been a lot of fun. But I was listening to a podcast yesterday where a young girl was talking about, the kids at her school, they have relationships. I mean, most of their relationships are all on their phone. Even dating now is just, you can be in a long-term dating relationship and never go out on a physical date with someone. That's just so, that's crazy to me. But yeah, it is a completely different generation. So they definitely are able and willing to have genuine relationships virtually. That's actually leads into, I'd love to hear you guys dig in. Our friend Alex asked, any tips on maintaining deeper, meaningful relationships virtually? We often send mobilizers to campuses and churches out of their area, but we know that relationships and connections are so key for Gen Z. So are you guys utilizing any specific, obviously we talked a little bit about being in DMs and doing some other things. Any other ideas that you're seeing successful?
One thing I would share regarding that is recognize that they have so many facets to who they are, things they're involved in, things that they're doing. So I think one thing that mobilizers don't do very well is have connection and interest with the other parts of Gen Z. And to them, it is so integrated. So if you are, only seeing them once a semester, then what does it look like to be keeping up with the other parts of their life through text messaging, I would say text messaging over email, even like personal social media accounts, asking about how did that test go? Hey, you told me you were really not sure if business is for you. What have you been thinking about that? Or, I know you've been really struggling plugging into a church body because of this specific fear. How is that going? So make sure that your connection point is also like including holistically all of the things that they're walking through, and not just, what are you thinking about missions? Have you thought about doing our short-term trip? And you're going to find that, yeah, we'll do text messaging, and usually I will only email if it's, do you want to set up a Zoom call? Or if something very important, I'll send it via email, and I'll text saying, hey, I sent you something via email. Can you take a look at it and let me know? So yeah, having ongoing Zoom conversations. We found it helpful to sometimes invite young adults to do a study with us. That might lower the anxiety of like saying yes to getting on a Zoom call with a stranger for like multiple times throughout the semester. What is that going to be? They're expecting me to like know all these answers, that can feel kind of scary. So saying, hey, what's your address? Let me send you on Amazon Prime so-and-so book, and let's walk through it together. And let them be in the driver's seat. What's a topic about missions that you're really interested in? Hey, here's a resource I have on that. Let me send you this podcast, and let's Zoom next week and talk about it for like 20 minutes. So kind of connecting them to resources and opportunities as you're keeping that ongoing communication. But yeah, I'm seeing a lot of success with just text and Zoom, honestly, or FaceTime.
And I would echo, just be consistent. So even if you text or you follow up and they don't respond, just in a little while, a couple weeks or something, send them another text. Hey, just thinking about you, praying for you, or how can I pray for you? So just being consistent, regardless of what their response might be at times.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you so much. Julie asks, what do you feel like is one or more of the best methods of evangelism to use with Gen Z?
So Gen Z tends to be very much in the moment. They're used to a phone notifications telling them what to do next, or getting text messages or things. So really walking with them, doing life with them, and when they experience a crisis where they feel the need for something, that's where the questions really can come to the surface. Often we're seeing Gen Z can be very distracted and not even thinking deeply about certain things because they are managing so many different relationships and messages and all of that. So just being present in their life so that when that crisis occurs or when those questions come up, you're there, you're present. They know that they can have those conversations with you. So that is one effective way, is just to really engage where the Holy Spirit is already working in their lives, because that's where they're most likely to be responsive, and just being discerning of where that is would be one thing. Katy, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I think another thing, I briefly touched on this earlier, but using your own story. So when they are just around you all the time, they get to see when you're stressed. What does it look like, how you can communicate, how you respond when you're stressed, and using your own story. They get to see that on display. When they see you struggle with a failure, what does it look like for you in the way that you respond to that? That is going to show them Jesus so strongly in a way that's compelling to them. And you need to be honest as well about some of the questions and struggles that you have, and you'll find as you are open and honest about your own, they will feel that you are a safe place to engage. And creating just that safe space where they know that they will be embraced no matter what, will I think really draw young adults to you. I talk about the way we spend our money, the way we made decisions about buying a house, things that they don't even there aren't contexts for what they're experiencing, but if I'm talking about the way I went to Jesus, the way I heard from Jesus, the way I made a decision based on this thing about Jesus in my own decisions, they are hearing those truths, and they're gonna be attracted to that.
One other thing that I'll just add, and we touched on this, asking open-ended questions and actively listening. There's a whole section in the book on this. There's a whole appendix with like questions, sample questions in the book. But it's so powerful because young people today are so distracted. They have so much information coming at them all the time. They're often not pausing to think deeply about what they're experiencing or what they're thinking. So even in evangelizing, the power of questions versus us telling them, asking the questions that allow the Holy Spirit to draw out what he is wanting them to understand. Because if they say it, again, as an individualistic generation, if they say it in their own words, as their thought or experience, it has a lot more validity than just another voice talking at them, which they have so many voices talking at them. So really pausing to ask those questions. So why do you feel like you're struggling with that? Have you struggled with that before? What do you think God's response is to that struggle? Asking these types of open-ended questions that force them to stop and actually think deeply about God and his connection to them can be really, really powerful as well.
Yeah, that's really, really good. Thank you. Next question is, in what context are you having your best conversations with Gen Z about missions?
That's a good conversation. Good question.
I will just jump in. I feel like my life is very different from Katie's. We're in very different environments. So I do a lot of training, speaking, and then just engaging Gen Z in my everyday life, with my kids and my church and my community. And so in my context, it's literally just being present. Even when I'm sitting at a church event or, we're doing some, local community event, I find the Gen Zer and sit down next to them and just start asking questions. And like Katy was saying, caring about their life holistically. And then as I start to share my story, for me, it's natural. I'm a missionary kid. My parents are missionaries. It always comes out and we start talking about, risk, all those things. Like I take my kids overseas. Well, how can you do that? Isn't it scary? So just my story and just being intentional and cultivating relationships that lead to conversation has been so powerful. I mean, I've had conversations to talk to young people and they're now pursuing things that they've never even thought about before, because it just wasn't on their radar. So those relationships are just so key in whatever context you're in. Katy has a lot more natural, given that she's at GoCorps right now as a mobilizer, but I think it can really happen in any context.
Yeah. I mean, I would 100% agree with that. Actually, some of my most life-giving conversations I've had recently with students as I've seen them look towards missions have been when I was at a conference and just sitting on a bench and there was a young person right next to me. And they just started asking me questions. And sometimes you have to take the first step. Sometimes it could be you extend a hand to this generation when you take the first step to start very easily with just a question like, hey, why'd you come to this conference? Ask them first questions that they easily know how to answer. And that's going to build their confidence as they then start getting into a conversation. Yeah, I would say a lot of times some of my best opportunities to see a shift in their thinking as it relates to missions is when the entry point of the conversation wasn't missions. And that's just something for mobilizers to keep in mind. What is the entry point of the conversation? Is it, hey, have you ever thought about missions? Or is the entry point of the conversation, hey, I met you on campus last week and you were really thinking about this thing. I'd love to chat about that. Or, tell me what you're studying. Why are you studying that? What of your classes has been your favorite? If you had to put together this degree plan, what do you think you would take out? What do you think you would add? And then as you hear those things, you get to then invite them to consider missions in a way that it was kind of an entry point that they started. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. It's as I'm listening to all of your ideas and your suggestions, one of the things that keeps coming to mind is these are the basic ways to talk to people. Like we talk a lot about this when we coach mission agencies. Try taking a pastor to coffee and not have a brochure in your back pocket. Develop those relationships, ask about their ministry, what excites them about what's going on, what keeps them up at night, those types of questions. So while, yes, there are absolutely so many differences in the generations, I think there's still people created in the image of Christ where, they are passionate. They, want to change the world. They sometimes, I love, one person says they want to climb Everest, they just can't see the mountain. I love that kind of idea. So it's like, let's work alongside them to help them see that it takes a while and it's a marathon, not a sprint. But that was just encouraging to me, like just the basics of getting to know a person and establishing a relationship can go a long way. So I really do appreciate. There are a bunch of questions we cannot get to. There's also some of you that ask questions that I really think will be contextually better offline. They're great questions, but I think Jolene and Katy could probably help you better in a different setting. So I'm gonna send those to them and let them follow up with you. I would just say, in closing, we'll make this the last thoughts from you both. I don't know, what's one thing that you would love for everyone to take away from this? What's maybe one next step? Putting you on the spot a little bit, but if it were to sum up and just say, here's really something we want to leave you with, what would that be?
I'll just get mine in really quick. My first one is just believe in them. Many times they aren't even believing in themselves. So believe in them and let them know that you are with them and for them and walking alongside them. And you are going to see a lot of them be able to take steps that you never even thought they'd be able to take when they have that belief in them. Believe in them as organizations. It might take a lot of work to change the way you think, to change the way you interact, to change the way you engage, but it is worth it. They are worth believing in.
That's so good. They're desperate for hope. And so when people believe in them, that's very powerful. The other thing I would just encourage you, when I present on the Daniel generations, which is what I really feel like they are, they're a generation in exile in a way as a post-Christian generation. I always encourage leaders to think about who are your Daniels and Esthers? Who are the young people that are in your life? You are their Mordecai, you are their Jeremiah, that they're reading your letters. Who are those young people who are having to navigate things we never had to navigate, who are having to deal with questions and wrestle with situations that older generations are sometimes oblivious to. But who are your 2 or 3 Daniels and Esthers? Who are those 2 or 3 young people that you're going to be so intentional with? We can't do this relational engagement at this deep level with a lot, but we can have a few. And, we see Jesus doing this. So just really being intentional and thoughtful about who are your 2 or 3 or 4 that really are the ones you feel God's calling you to really invest in deeply in this season.
Awesome. Well, Jolene, Katy, thank you so much. This was such a blessing. I don't know if Matthew mentioned, we had over 200 people register for this webinar. So this is obviously a topic that has a lot of interest. If you have not got a copy of Mobilizing Gen Z, I highly recommend it. I've got my copy sitting here on my desk and I've really been enjoying it. And so I highly recommend it. You can get it on Amazon, or is there a better place to get it? Sometimes Amazon is not the best place, or do you guys care?
Or Mission Books, that's the publisher, is William Carey Publishing, so missionbooks.org is their website, so there's a good place too.
Yeah, absolutely. We love William Carey Publishing, so go to missionbooks.org, great way to support them. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming, and we will see you on the next webinar. Thank you.
Well, we hope you are blessed by what you heard today. To learn more about the ministry of 1615 and how we serve churches, simply log on to 1615.org. And by the way, don't forget to like and subscribe.